So, crime and punishment, yes, and a reference to Russia that has played such an important part in keeping Cuba afloat. That was before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then Cuba had to stand on its feet in a very big hurry once the Soviet Union collapsed, and about 3/4 of their income and their economy collapsed as well when they faced starvation conditions and had to rebuild yet again. So in this talk, we're going to do a little bit of background history. You probably all know quite a bit about Cuba, so I hope that I'm not showing you too much stuff that you already know. We'll also focus on some important documents that happened around the time of the revolution, what stayed in place since then in terms of the sanctions or the punishment part against Cuba from the United States government. And we'll also draw a little bit on some of the illustrations and photos to help illustrate the points we want to make. So, a little bit of background. So, you saw the map that Saul showed you. So you've got the American continent there, and you've got Cuba right up there in the Gulf. And it's only around 90 k's at its closest point. About 90 miles, about 145 k's, but at its closest point between Cuba and the United States. So we're talking about Florida, which is where you hear through the Western media, that's where you get a lot of information in English, is via Florida. So Florida is like that with Cuba. So you get a lot of information and misinformation through Florida. So back 500 years ago, when, or a bit over now, when Christopher Columbus was mapping out the world for Spanish colonisation, and he came to Cuba. At that time, the people who were living there were the Taino people and the Silonais people. And through the process of colonisation, like what's happened in Australia and certainly around the world, Indigenous people lost out big time during those processes. It was thought for a long while that there were no First Nations people living in Cuba anymore, but towards the eastern end of the island there are descendants of Taino people. Rather than calling themselves Taino people, they usually say we're descendants of Taino people. And you can see quite clearly quite physical differences between people, and you realise that Cuba, like most countries around the world, is made up of a really big mix of people. So in Cuba's case, the indigenous people and their descendants, the Europeans, and the people that they brought over during the slave trade from Africa, from West Africa, mostly Nigeria. So the slave trade was huge, and Cuba and Havana provided and Santiago de Cuba, at the other end of the island, provided places, a marketplace where people would come from different countries to buy and sell slaves. The British continued the slave trade in that 1 year when they had a fight with Spain, and they took over for a while certain parts of Havana, certain parts of Grenada. They upped the ante on slave trade, then Spain took it back again. And then during that time, the United States was growing in importance in terms of power and expansion itself. And really things took a bit of a change of direction when the US became a competitor to Spain. So in the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, the United States government declared that any act of aggression in the Americas would be considered an act of aggression against the United States. And so that sort of pitted Spain and US against each other, and Cuba was caught up in that. Cuba was one of the later countries in Latin America to abolish slavery, probably 40 to 60 years later than the other countries. So there's a lot of vested interest by the United States to hold on to the arrangement they had of exploitation of labour, mostly through the African slaves. And there was also, particularly after the Monroe Doctrine, all throughout that period and right up until the Cuban Revolution of 1959 that most of us know about, there were a lot of uprising, unrest, the use of the military to squash rebellions. There was a lot of activity in independence struggles in Cuba. And then the Platt Amendment, just after the turn of the century in 1901, consolidated the US force over Cuba by saying that anything that happened in Cuba basically had to be sanctioned by the United States. And it was written into the Cuban Constitution that the US could intervene militarily for whatever reason it deemed to be important to its own interests. So it was there in the Constitution. So it really pretty well cemented Cuba's subservience to the United States. So that's just a bit of background history. So when the 1959 Cuban Revolution came about, Fulgencio Batista was the president at the time. You could say that the country was probably noted for incredible levels of corruption. Fulgencio Batista himself was a military man and used military regularly before he took over to suppress activities, to thwart candidates who wanted to stand for presidency. At the time, there was also a huge divide between the city and the countryside, where the country is missing out big time high levels of unemployment because the sugar prices were falling, so there wasn't a lot of employment around, high levels of illiteracy. I think in the countryside, up as much as like 97%. It was huge. Education levels were incredibly low. Unemployment and therefore poverty. So it was a really dire state of affairs. And then in the cities, of course, you had the wealthy people from the United States coming to Cuba as like a trip to New Zealand on the weekends. That's where we'll go, and except that we'll have our casinos and our golf. And I think Trump also was interested in having a golf course there at one time. So it was quite a dire situation. And so the Cuban Revolution, I guess, for many of us, we know of it through some of the photos that we've seen, and probably the most famous one is the one in the top right corner there of Che Guevara. And the person who took that photo, Alberto Corda, that's him sitting there beside that, he was a photographer at the time who was taking photographs for the high-end fashion market. So he was caught up in the revolution at the time, and his works are really interesting to see. But I really love this particular picture that he took on the arrival of the tank, when Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos and Fidel Castro arrived in the street. So it wasn't a popular uprising, I don't think so. So you can see the kind of support over many, many years of building struggle to arrive at that point where they confiscated the tanks from the military when they took over, and by the time they rode into the cities, there was a lot of people in support of him there. But Alberto Corda's favourite photo is actually that one over there of the little girl, and that's the photo that he says made him decide he was going to stay in Cuba. Of this little girl out in the rural area, and I can't remember where we went. We went to that place, but I've forgotten where it was now. Where was it? Del Rio, which is at the western edge of the island, and her family, the family is still there, and so she just had this block of wood which she had some material around it for her doll, and so that was his sort of transformative moment. When he saw that, he thought, oh, there's a story here, I'm going to stay. And so he stayed, and he became Fidel Castro's personal photographer, and through his wonderful collection of photographs, you get to see a lot of everyday encounters about what it was, not only to what that amounted to. Do you know when that was taken? That would have been of the little girl. Well, I imagine that would have been taken after the revolution because of the fashion work that he was doing beforehand. Yeah. So I'm guessing. It'll be, if I looked it up, early 60s, yeah. If I looked it up, there'll be... but she's our age. Yeah, I suppose so. So the crimes and the punishment, you can take it however you want to in terms of how we look at the crimes, but Locke, would you like to
Well,
do
yeah,
this?
so the revolution, the big crime simply was for Cuba to assert their sovereignty and to say that they were going to be in charge of their own destiny. And the United States, that was a total affront to the United States. Cuba, at the start of the revolution, wanted to, it expropriated some of the oil refineries and that were foreign owned, and the United States would stop selling oil to Cuba, and so Cuba, the Russians, the Soviet Union offered oil, and so that was the beginning of the Cuban Soviet trade relationship, and that increased tensions with the United States. They also, there was, so this photograph here of Fidel giving the second declaration of Havana in the early days of the revolution, where he increased nationalisation of foreign-owned companies in Cuba, and they also foreign-owned land. They expropriated that and started developing their own agricultural industries. They offered some compensation which was refused, and this is a sore point to this day by some of those aging landholders. Cuba's big crime, according to some analysts anyway, is their support for Southern Africa, and this was the struggles in Angola, Namibia, and South Africa, where to their own detriment, they militarily supported the struggle in Africa for the liberation of South Africa, and this is something that really stuck with the United States, and it's probably has been cited as one of the principal reasons that the sanction regime has been maintained for as long as it has. So this photograph of the sugar, some of the sugar land that was taken back, and of course in asserting their sovereignty, they a whole series of including a massive literacy campaign, which